A respectable life can be built around a conflict that never disappears. A person may do competent work, keep promises, care for others, and still sense that some uninvited motive is moving behind the visible one. Anger appears in the wrong room. Admiration carries a thread of envy. A dream gives an unknown face to a familiar fear. The effort to become consistent can then make the mind less honest, because consistency is purchased by excluding whatever does not fit. Carl Gustav Jung made a psychology from this uncomfortable possibility. He proposed that psychological health does not require every part of the mind to agree. It requires a more conscious relation among parts that remain different. This was his answer to a central human question. How can a person become more whole without erasing the conflicts, symbols, and hidden motives within the psyche? Jung's answer became one of the most influential interpretive systems of the 20th century. It gave us widely used words such as introversion, extroversion, archetype, persona, and synchronicity. It also produced claims that are difficult to test, cultural comparisons that can flatten important differences, and theories of gender that carry the assumptions of Jung's time. His work, therefore, asks for two kinds of attention. We can listen for what it reveals about experience while also asking what kind of evidence each claim can bear. The story begins in a divided house. Not only the divided house of a mind, but the divided intellectual world in which modern psychiatry was taking shape. Jung entered that world as a physician who measured pauses between words. He left it as a psychologist of dreams, myths, religions, and alchemy. Between those points lies a long attempt to understand why the parts we reject do not quietly vanish, and why an encounter with them may change the meaning of a life. Part 1. The Divided House. For Jung, the mind was never a single speaker. Consciousness could make plans, defend principles, and give a polished account of itself. Yet a forgotten name, a disproportionate irritation, or a repeating dream might interrupt that account. Such interruptions were not necessarily messages with one fixed translation. They were signs that conscious intention did not exhaust the activity of the psyche. The word psyche mattered to him because it named more than deliberate thought. It included conscious experience, personal memories outside awareness, emotional clusters that could seize attention, and symbolic patterns that he believed reached beyond individual biography. This breadth was both the strength and the danger of his approach. It allowed him to notice meaning where a narrower model might see only noise. It also tempted him to connect distant materials too confidently. The image of a divided house should not suggest that Jung imagined a collection of completely separate people inside one skull. His language could be dramatic, especially when he described complexes as partly autonomous. The practical point was more ordinary. A person may sincerely intend one thing while another disposition influences timing, tone, memory, or choice. We recognize the effect before we understand its source. Jung did not treat conflict itself as a failure. A mind without tension would have no reason to develop. The problem arose when consciousness identified with one position so completely that its opposite could appear only in distorted form. The dutiful person might become fascinated by irresponsibility in others. The self-declared rationalist might be governed by an unexamined fear. The gentle public manner might conceal fantasies of triumph or revenge. This is the first outline of Jung's distinctive idea of wholeness. Wholeness is not moral perfection, emotional comfort, or a final harmony in which every contradiction dissolves. It is an enlarging capacity to acknowledge more of what is present, to distinguish it, and to bear the tension without immediate denial. Some impulses must still be refused. Recognition is not obedience. That distinction protects Jung's thought from a common misuse. To encounter aggression, vanity, dependency, or erotic fantasy does not make any action inevitable or wise. Consciousness gains responsibility when it can name a motive without either becoming it or pretending it does not exist. The unknown part becomes available for judgment. This account remains an interpretive model, not a complete scientific map of the brain. Its concepts do not correspond neatly to isolated neural structures, and many cannot be operationalized with the precision expected in experimental psychology. Yet the model begins with an observation that remains hard to dismiss. People are not transparent to themselves. Jung's career started by giving that observation a measurable form in a hospital where a delayed answer could reveal the pressure beneath an ordinary word. The divided house also changes what self-knowledge means. If the mind contains motives that appear indirectly, introspection alone cannot guarantee truth. We need the friction of consequences, the responses of other people, and evidence that resists our preferred story. Jung sometimes trusted symbolic correspondence too readily, but his model at its best denies the ego the privilege of being its own final witness. A person becomes more whole through relationship and correction, not through private certainty. Part 2. From Kesswil to the Clinic. Carl Gustav Jung was born in 1875 in Kesswil, Switzerland, beside Lake Constance. His father was a pastor in the Swiss Reformed Church. Religious language was therefore close at hand, but certainty was not. Jung later described an early life filled with dreams, private rituals, theological questions, and a strong sense of inward division. Those memories are revealing, though they require a caution that applies to many famous lives. The best-known account, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, is not a simple autobiography written from beginning to end by Jung. It grew from interviews conducted by Agnella Jaffe late in his life, together with passages Jung wrote and other materials shaped by editors and publishers. Historians have shown that its production was complex. It should be read as a collaborative, selective construction of memory, not a transparent recording of childhood. What can be established more securely is that Jung studied medicine at the University of Basel from 1895. His reading ranged through philosophy, theology, spiritualism, and psychical research. At the end of 1900, he joined the Bergholzli Psychiatric Hospital in Zurich, directed by Eugen Bleuler. The institution stood near the center of an emerging clinical psychiatry that sought careful observation without abandoning difficult questions about subjective life. At the Bergholzli, Jung worked with severe mental illness and joined collaborative experiments in word association. His early reputation did not come from archetypes or alchemy. It came from timing responses, comparing patterns, and attempting to connect emotional disturbance with observable features of speech and memory. The later mythic psychologist began as an ambitious hospital physician whose work belonged to a wider Zurich research program. This matters because Jung's career is sometimes divided too neatly into a scientific youth and a mystical old age. There was a real change in emphasis, but both tendencies were present early. He wanted disciplined observation, and he was drawn to experiences that seemed to exceed conventional explanation. He read symptoms as facts and symbols as facts of another order. His enduring question was how to study meaning without reducing it to mechanics. In 1903, Jung married Emma Rauschenbach. They had 5 children, and Emma Jung later became an analyst and writer in her own right. The private arrangements of the marriage, including Jung's intimate relationship with Toni Wolff, have drawn biographical and ethical scrutiny. A complete portrait should not turn these people into supporting figures in one man's legend. Jung's psychological language grew within relationships marked by collaboration, inequality, dependence, and conflict. By 1909, he had left the Burgolsli for private practice and independent research. Before that departure, his work on associations had made him visible beyond Switzerland. It also brought him towards Sigmund Freud, whose theory of repression offered an account of why a word might acquire hidden emotional force. Their alliance would be intense, institutionally important, and brief. The disagreement between them was not a contest between pure science and pure spirituality. It was a struggle over how much the unconscious meant, where its energy came from, and who could define the future of a new movement. The hospital background remained important even after Jung's attention widened. Under Bleuler, the Burgolsli was a place where clinicians debated how disturbed speech, withdrawal, emotion, and association might belong together. Jung's later language about autonomous psychic activity grew partly from encounters with patients whose thoughts did not follow ordinary conscious intention. Yet severe illness cannot be made into a romantic doorway to wisdom. Clinical suffering and symbolic creativity may overlap in form while differing greatly in effect, safety, and need for care. Part 3. Freud and the Fault Line. Jung began corresponding with Sigmund Freud in 1906 and met him in Vienna the following year. Freud was almost 20 years older and had spent years defending psychoanalysis against hostility and neglect. Jung, a Swiss psychiatrist with hospital standing and experimental credentials, offered intellectual companionship and institutional reach. He also did not come from the Jewish milieu of many early psychoanalysts, a fact that Freud believed might help the movement gain wider acceptance in an anti-Semitic Europe. Their bond carried admiration, strategy, and a strong current of projection. Freud at times imagined Jung as an heir. Jung found in Freud a powerful explanation of repression, dream disguise, infantile sexuality, and the persistence of the past. Each also wanted from the other a confirmation that the other could not permanently provide. The relationship became a living example of the transferences both men studied, old expectations and emotional roles entering a present intellectual alliance. The theoretical fault line concerned libido. Freud gave sexuality a central explanatory role, though his mature theory was more complex than the claim that everything means sex. Jung increasingly used libido to name a broader psychic energy that could appear in sexuality, ambition, religion, imagination, and cultural creation. He thought a symbol might transform instinctual energy rather than merely disguise a forbidden wish. Their interpretations of dreams and myths also diverged. Freud often worked backward from a puzzling formation toward repressed personal conflict. Jung increasingly asked what an image might be trying to make possible in the present and future. A dream could compensate for a one-sided conscious attitude or sketch an undeveloped direction. This forward-looking function did not replace personal history, but it prevented the past from becoming the only source of meaning. Symbols of transformation, which developed from Jung's earlier psychology of the unconscious, announced much of this independence. Using the fantasies of an American woman published by Theodore Flournoy, Jung ranged across mythological material to argue for transformations of libido and recurring symbolic forms. The work helped precipitate the rupture, though personal authority, institutional politics, and mutual disappointment also mattered. The final break unfolded across 1912 and 1913. Jung resigned the presidency of the International Psychoanalytical Association in 1914. It is easy to turn this history into a clean fork. Freud goes towards sexuality and pathology, Jung towards spirit and growth. That is too simple. Freud wrote about culture, religion, repetition, and conflict beyond immediate pleasure. Jung continued to treat suffering and to analyze the personal past. Their real difference lay in explanatory priority and method. Freud feared that expanding libido would make theory vague. Jung feared that a predominantly sexual theory would force symbolic life into one interpretive channel. Both fears were justified. A theory can explain too little by being narrow, and it can explain too much by becoming elastic. Jung's later vocabulary allows many experiences to be linked, but the link may rest on the interpreter's judgment. Freud's narrower claims often invite clearer disagreement, yet psychoanalytic explanations also face problems of testing and retrospective confirmation. The rupture left Jung professionally freer and personally shaken. In the years that followed, he began the prolonged self-experiment that became the Red Book. Before entering that interior landscape, however, it helps to stay with the modest laboratory procedure that first taught him how a hidden emotional organization could disturb a conscious reply. The break also shaped two institutional traditions that later told the story differently. Psychoanalytic histories often treated Jung's expansion of libido and interest in religion as a retreat from disciplined explanation. Jungian histories often presented Freud as a dogmatist who could not tolerate symbolic freedom. Letters and organizational records reveal a less flattering symmetry. Theoretical dispute became entangled with loyalty, succession, injury, and control. Their ideas cannot be reduced to personality, but neither were they produced outside relationship. Part 4. The word that hesitates. In a word association experiment, a researcher presents a stimulus word and asks for the first response that comes to mind. The procedure did not originate with Jung, and the Zurich work was collaborative rather than a solitary invention. What Jung and his colleagues emphasized was the pattern of disturbance. A delayed answer, repetition of the prompt, an unusual response, a lapse of memory when the pair was tested again, or a bodily change might indicate that the stimulus had touched an emotionally charged group of ideas. Jung called such a group a complex. A complex could gather memories, expectations, images, and feelings around a theme such as authority, abandonment, status, or guilt. The important point was organization. A complex was not one hidden sentence waiting to be decoded. It behaved more like a sensitive network. Touch one point, and a larger configuration answered. Consider a neutral list that includes house, money, mother, duty, and alone. Most answers arrive promptly. At one word, the speaker pauses, laughs, gives a formal definition, and later forgets what was said. None of these signs proves a particular secret. Together, they may suggest that the word has more emotional weight for this person than its dictionary meaning explains. Further conversation would be needed, and even then interpretation could be wrong. This caution matters because association tests acquired a popular aura of detection. Jung himself sometimes described their forensic possibilities. Yet a delay can have many causes: distraction, language, fatigue, uncertainty, or an effort to please the examiner. A contemporary history of the method shows that the early program never settled into one simple, stable test. Its importance lies as much in the development of clinical personality assessment as in any lasting diagnostic power. The complex survived after the apparatus receded because it named a recognizable experience. A person enters a meeting prepared to discuss a small problem. One remark from a supervisor changes the emotional scale of the room. The response no longer fits the immediate event because an older pattern has been activated. Jung sometimes said that we do not have complexes so much as complexes have us. Taken cautiously, this means that a charged pattern can temporarily narrow attention and action. Complexes are not all pathological. Family belonging, vocational devotion, or a powerful sense of justice can also organize emotion and memory. The question is how autonomous the pattern becomes and how little choice remains when it is activated. A complex may carry useful energy alongside distortion. Anger around unfairness can reveal a value while still misreading a particular situation. This is one of Jung's most durable contributions because it stays close to observation. Modern psychology uses other vocabularies for associative networks, schemas, implicit memory, conditioned responses, and emotionally biased attention. These are not simple confirmations of Jung, and their mechanisms differ. Still, they share the idea that present behavior is shaped by organized processes outside immediate awareness. The early experiment, therefore, opens the door to the personal unconscious. It does not yet justify a collective unconscious or inherited symbolic forms. Those are larger steps with larger evidential burdens. Jung took them because individual biography seemed unable, in his judgment, to account for the scale and strangeness of the images he met in dreams, psychosis, religion, and myth. It would also be misleading to call the association work an early lie detector. A complex indicator does not distinguish deception from shame, confusion, fear, or surprise. The procedure shows disturbance, not its correct interpretation. This modest lesson deserves emphasis because later depth psychology often moved too quickly from a reaction to a meaning. Measurement can identify that something happened. Context, conversation, and alternative explanations are still needed to understand what happened. The hesitation in an association test also reveals something about time. Conscious explanation often arrives after the body has already changed its rhythm. A pause lengthens, breath tightens, a joke appears, or attention suddenly wanders. The person may provide a convincing reason for the response, yet the sequence suggests that interpretation began after disturbance. Jung's early work is valuable because it places self-knowledge inside this delay. We do not always decide what we feel and then express it. We often meet an effect and construct an account around it. That observation does not grant the examiner privileged access to the hidden cause. A clinician sees the pause but does not automatically know its meaning. The participant may associate the word father with grief, fear, tenderness, financial pressure, or a memory unrelated to the examiner's theory. The ethical task is to preserve the difference between detecting a disturbance and claiming ownership of its interpretation. Jung's later method was at its strongest when meaning developed through dialogue and at its weakest when symbolic expertise closed the question too quickly. Complexes can be understood as economies of attention. Once activated, they select evidence, accelerate certain memories, and make some responses easier than others. A person organized by a complex around humiliation may notice every doubtful expression in a room while missing neutral or welcoming ones. The resulting behavior can then provoke distance, which appears to confirm the original expectation. The complex does not need to invent reality from nothing. It can build a closed pattern by amplifying some real signals and excluding others. This helps explain why insight may not immediately change behavior. Naming the pattern is only one event inside a network that includes bodily arousal, rehearsed responses, relationships, and environments. A person can understand in the morning that criticism activates an old fear and still become defensive in the afternoon. Repetition does not prove that insight was false. It shows that the complex has a history longer than the explanation. New responses need practice under conditions where the old organization is actually active. There is also a social history inside what appears personal. A complex around status may be shaped by family comparison, but also by workplaces that make recognition scarce. A complex around belonging may be intensified by discrimination or migration. Analytical language should not turn institutional conditions into private pathology. The psyche responds to a real world, even when its response also carries earlier patterns. Good interpretation distinguishes inner amplification from external cause instead of using one to erase the other. The modesty of the word experiment offers a standard for Jung's larger system. Begin with an observable interruption. Gather context. Compare possible explanations. Notice recurrence. Remain prepared to revise. The procedure cannot by itself prove archetypes, the self, or synchronicity, but it models an attitude in which hidden organization is inferred from effects rather than announced by intuition. In that narrow discipline, the delayed word becomes a lesson in both depth and restraint. Part 5. The personal and the collective. Jung divided unconscious life into two broad layers. The personal unconscious included forgotten experiences, subliminal perceptions, repressed material, and contents that had never fully reached awareness. It was personal, not because it was sealed away from culture, but because its history belonged to an individual's life. Complexes were among its characteristic formations. The collective unconscious was a much stronger hypothesis. Jung proposed that beneath personal acquisition lay inherited dispositions common to human beings. He did not usually mean a storehouse containing complete mythological pictures, as if a child were born with a library of legends. His more careful formulations described archetypes as formal tendencies that shape the production of images, somewhat as instincts organize patterns of behavior. The distinction between a form and an image is essential. An archetype, in this stricter sense, cannot be seen directly. What appears in a dream, story, ritual, or fantasy is an archetypal image, a culturally and personally clothed expression. A threatening stranger, a wise elder, a descent underground, or a circle divided into four might be interpreted as such an image. Its details come from a life and a culture, even if Jung believed the organizing tendency had a deeper source. Why did he make this claim? Across clinical reports, religious traditions, folk tales, and art, he noticed recurring motifs. Some appeared, he thought, in people with little likely knowledge of the historical parallels. He also regarded the regularities of instinct and bodily development as evidence that the psyche would have inherited structure. If perception and emotion are not blank at birth, imagination might also possess characteristic forms. This reasoning has an intuitive part and an uncertain leap. Human beings share bodies, developmental needs, environments, and basic social problems. Birth, dependence, rivalry, danger, mating, caregiving, aging, and death can generate recurrent themes without requiring the inheritance of complex symbolic patterns. Culture also travels farther than an interpreter may know. Similar images may arise through shared perception, convergent storytelling, diffusion, or selective comparison. Contemporary reviews within and beyond analytical psychology find no firm scientific basis for claiming that elaborate patterns, such as a hero myth, are biologically transmitted and universally available. The problem is not that human minds lack evolved structure. The problem is moving from general dispositions to specific symbolic narratives, then showing what evidence could distinguish inheritance from culture and common circumstance. The collective unconscious should therefore be presented as Jung's interpretive and developmental hypothesis, not an experimentally proven layer of mind. Some later thinkers preserve a modest version by treating archetypes as emergent patterns shaped by biology, development, culture, and imagination together. Others reject the concept as unnecessary or unfalsifiable. The disagreement changes what an archetype is allowed to explain. Even under criticism, Jung's distinction points toward a useful question. When a private image feels larger than private memory, what kinds of history are speaking through it? Family history may be present. So may inherited biology, language, religion, political imagery, film, architecture, and stories absorbed without notice. The mind is personal without being self-created. This broader belonging is real, even if Jung's proposed mechanism remains doubtful. No person invents the basic materials of meaning alone, yet common materials do not guarantee a common interpretation. A snake can be danger, healing, renewal, sexuality, ancestry, food, divinity, or an actual animal. The context decides what possibilities deserve attention. To reduce the image to a universal code would betray the open symbolic method Jung wanted, even though his own comparisons sometimes approached that danger. From this uncertain foundation came the figures most associated with his name. Persona, shadow, anima, animus, and self are often called archetypes, but they do different jobs in the system. Their value becomes clearer when we treat them as relations and processes, not a set of hidden characters waiting backstage. The layered model can also be compared with an archaeological site, provided the image is not taken literally. Recent personal material does not simply sit above ancient universal material in neat deposits. Memory is reconstructed, culture enters from the beginning, and biology develops through environment. What looks ancient may have been learned yesterday, while an early disposition may appear in a modern form. Jung's two layers orient inquiry, but contemporary knowledge favors interaction over a clean border between what is personal and what is collective. Part 6. Archetypes without a dictionary. The word archetype easily creates the wrong picture. It sounds like a timeless statue placed in the mind, identical in every person and waiting to be discovered. Jung's formulations changed across decades, and his followers have continued to disagree about them. At his most careful, the archetype was less like a statue than a tendency to form certain kinds of experience. The visible image was one local realization of that tendency. This resembles the difference between a capacity for language and a particular sentence. A shared human capacity does not determine whether the sentence will be spoken in German, Arabic, or Yoruba. Nor does it determine what the sentence will say. Jung did not develop this analogy with the precision of modern linguistics, but it helps separate general form from cultural content. It also shows how much explanatory work remains between them. The recurring figures in Jungian discussion include the child, the mother, the trickster, the hero, the wise old person, and the self. Each gathers a wide range of images. The child might appear as vulnerability, new possibility, dependence, futurity, or the return of an unfinished beginning. But once an interpreter declares that every child image means renewal, the symbol becomes a label. Its particular mood, action, relationship, and setting disappear. Jung distinguished a symbol from a sign. A sign points to something already known, as a traffic light directs movement. A living symbol expresses something not yet adequately understood. It can hold opposed meanings without becoming meaningless. Fire may destroy and illuminate. Water may threaten, cleanse, conceal, or sustain. The symbol remains active because no short definition uses it up. This approach can deepen attention. Suppose a person repeatedly dreams of a neglected railway station. A fixed dictionary might declare that trains mean life paths. A more responsible inquiry asks what stations have meant in that life, who is absent, whether anything arrives, what emotion remains on waking, and what has recently been postponed. Historical and mythic parallels can amplify the image, but they should not replace the dreamer's associations. Amplification was Jung's method of placing an image beside related motifs from myth, religion, art, and folklore. It differs from free association, which follows the dreamer's personal chain of thoughts away from the image. Amplification circles the image and gives it a larger field. Used with restraint, it prevents a symbol from being reduced too quickly. Used without restraint, it lets the analyst display learning while the individual's life grows faint. The cultural criticism is serious. Jung often drew materials from Africa, Asia, indigenous traditions, classical antiquity, and European esotericism into a comparative psychology centered on his own categories. Such comparison can illuminate recurring human concerns, but it can also detach practices from languages, institutions, colonial histories, and the authority of living communities. Calling two forms archetypally equivalent may erase what makes each one specific. There is also a selection problem. Human beings produce an enormous variety of images. Once an interpreter expects a pattern, matching examples stand out and non-matching examples recede. The theory can then confirm itself through the archive it has assembled. A scientific approach would need clear definitions, systematic sampling, and conditions under which the claim could fail. Much archetypal interpretation does not meet those standards. Yet archetypes have remained influential because they offer a language for scale. Some experiences seem to exceed the current event. Grief may carry every earlier separation. A public leader may attract fantasies of rescue or destruction far beyond any realistic power. A newborn child may reorganize a family's sense of time. Archetypal language can describe this enlargement without proving that a universal image has been inherited. The wisest use is therefore provisional. An archetypal interpretation is a question offered to experience, not a verdict imposed upon it. Does this image connect a private conflict with a wider human pattern? Does the comparison reveal more detail, or does it wash detail away? The answer depends on what the interpretation allows us to see. This discipline becomes especially important with the persona and shadow, because these ideas can either support moral reflection or become convenient names for judging other people. Art shows why the concept survives despite its scientific weakness. A novel can create a stranger who feels both historically specific and strangely familiar. The familiarity may come from genre, earlier reading, common social experience, shared development, or an archetypal disposition. Interpretation need not decide the mechanism before describing the effect. Trouble begins only when aesthetic recognition is presented as biological proof. The language of archetype is often strongest as criticism of meaning and weakest as an unqualified causal theory. An archetype without a dictionary cannot be reduced to a standard translation. The image of a house may concern the body, family, security, status, memory, enclosure, or none of these in a particular dream. Its meaning develops through the dreamer's life and the image's specific behavior. Is the house familiar or impossible? Is one room inaccessible? Does it shelter or imprison? A universal label that ignores these details destroys the very symbolic richness it claims to explain. Recurring forms are nevertheless part of human culture. Journeys, thresholds, doubles, transformations, contests, descents, and returns appear across many traditions. Similarity can arise through shared bodily life, recurrent social problems, contact between cultures, inherited narrative conventions, and convergent imagination. Jung's archetypal hypothesis adds an inherited psychic disposition to this list. The hypothesis is strongest when treated as one possible account of recurrence, not as a shortcut around historical research. The difference matters in comparative religion. Two flood stories may share a broad structure while serving very different ritual, political, and theological purposes. Calling both expressions of one archetype can illuminate a family resemblance, but it can also flatten the voices that carried each story. Responsible comparison moves in both directions. It notices resemblance and then returns to difference. What does each tradition say that the other does not? Who interpreted the story, under what conditions, and with what authority? Archetypal interpretation also carries a temptation of scale. An ordinary conflict feels more important when described as the hero's journey or the confrontation with the dragon. The enlarged frame can give courage, but it can also inflate the ego. A workplace disagreement becomes a cosmic battle. A difficult parent becomes the devouring archetype. The interpreter begins to inhabit a myth in which compromise appears as betrayal. Jung warned about inflation, yet his language can easily produce it. A safer use treats archetypal imagery as a question about form. What human problem does this image organize? Separation from protection, rivalry between generations, fear of the unknown, the wish for renewal, or the cost of power may take recognizable shapes. The form can guide attention, while the content remains personal and historical. The image does not decide the action. It creates a field in which overlooked meanings can be considered. Modern cognitive and evolutionary accounts of recurrent imagery do not simply confirm Jung, but they can clarify why the question persists. Shared perceptual systems, threat responses, attachment needs, and developmental transitions constrain imagination. Cultural transmission then supplies an immense archive of forms. Whether an additional collective unconscious is required remains disputed. The intellectually honest position is not to deny recurrence or to declare its mechanism settled. Without a dictionary, archetypal thought becomes slower and more relational. The dreamer, text, culture, and interpreter all place limits on one another. An image earns significance by opening a more exact understanding, not by sounding ancient. This protects the symbol from becoming a code and protects the person from being subordinated to the interpreter's favorite mythology. Part 7. Persona, Shadow, and Projection. Persona was the Latin name for a theatrical mask. Jung used it for the social presentation through which a person meets the world. A teacher, surgeon, parent, musician, or judge must acquire a role with appropriate habits and restraints. The persona is therefore not automatically false. Social life would become exhausting if every passing impulse demanded public expression. A workable mask protects both the individual and the people around them. Trouble begins when the role claims to be the whole person. Professional competence becomes an identity that cannot survive uncertainty. Kindness becomes a performance that forbids anger. Rebellion becomes a costume that cannot admit a need for belonging. The persona then narrows the field of possible experience. Whatever contradicts it is pushed toward the shadow. The shadow contains qualities the conscious personality does not recognize as its own. Some are rejected because they are shameful or frightening. Others are simply incompatible with the chosen identity. A person praised for seriousness may exile play. Someone organized around self-sacrifice may be unable to acknowledge ambition. The shadow is therefore not a bag of evil. It can contain aggression and deceit, but also energy, tenderness, humor, or talent that the persona could not accommodate. Jung regarded the shadow as comparatively accessible because it often appears through projection. Projection occurs when a person experiences a feature of their own psychic life as if it belonged entirely to someone else. The word has become casual, sometimes meaning nothing more than hypocrisy. In analytical psychology, it names a broader process by which an unconscious content shapes perception of another person or group. Imagine a colleague whose confidence provokes immediate contempt. The contempt may be an accurate response to arrogance. It may also carry the observer's disowned wish to speak with authority. Both can be true. Withdrawing a projection does not require deciding that the other person is innocent. It means separating what evidence belongs to the other from what emotional surplus comes from oneself. This separation is slow because projection arrives as perception. We do not first manufacture a private image and then knowingly attach it to someone. The world simply appears organized by it. One person seems uniquely helpless, another uniquely dangerous, another destined to understand us. Strong idealization can be as projective as hatred. In each case, the actual person becomes the screen for an inner drama. Group life magnifies the process. Communities build cohesion by assigning virtue inward and shadow outward. An opponent is no longer mistaken about a policy, but corrupt in essence. Historical enemies become containers for fear, impurity, weakness, or forbidden desire. Jung's language can help describe this mechanism, though it should not replace political and historical analysis. Material interests, institutions, propaganda, and real violence cannot be explained away as projections. Shadow work is often presented in popular culture as a set of prompts for discovering a hidden, authentic self. Jung's idea is less comfortable. Recognition does not reveal a pure identity underneath convention. It complicates identity. The person who admits envy does not become an envious essence. The admission makes it possible to distinguish longing, comparison, and resentment, then to choose how each will be handled. There is an ethical limit here. Some qualities are excluded for good reasons. Integration does not mean performing cruelty to prove that one has accepted a cruel capacity. It may mean recognizing the wish to humiliate before it shapes a supposedly righteous action. The shadow becomes less dangerous when moral responsibility reaches it, not when morality is suspended. Nor should the concept be used to dismiss criticism. If someone reports harm, it is evasive to say the complaint is merely their shadow. That move gives the interpreter unearned authority and makes the theory immune to correction. A genuine encounter with projection begins with uncertainty about one's own view. It does not turn another person's experience into evidence of their blindness. The persona and shadow form one pair of opposites, but Jung's system contains another pair that became far more entangled with the gender assumptions of his era. The Anima and Animus were meant to describe a bridge toward unconscious life. Their historical form now requires both explanation and revision. Projection also returns after it has been recognized. Insight into one episode does not remove the mind's tendency to organize perception through expectation. The practical change is a shorter distance between reaction and reflection. A person may learn to pause before turning intensity into certainty. That pause is small, but it is where evidence, memory, and another person's account can enter. Shadow recognition becomes less a dramatic descent than a repeated correction in ordinary time. The persona often becomes rigid through success rather than failure. A role that has brought respect, income, or belonging acquires strong reasons to defend itself. The capable manager is rewarded for decisiveness until uncertainty feels like exposure. The dependable father is praised for steadiness until grief seems incompatible with his place in the family. The independent thinker receives admiration for skepticism until trust feels like surrender. What began as a useful adaptation becomes a contract with the surrounding world. Shadow then develops not only from forbidden impulses, but from capacities that would disturb the contract. The manager's need for help, the father's vulnerability, and the skeptic's longing for faith do not vanish. They appear indirectly through contempt, fascination, fatigue, or attachment to people who carry the excluded quality. In this sense, projection is economical. Another person is recruited to hold what the persona cannot admit without renegotiating its identity. Withdrawing projection is difficult because the social contract may be real. A workplace may punish vulnerability. A family may depend too heavily on one person's steadiness. A community organized around ideological certainty may reject open doubt. Psychological integration cannot be reduced to private confession. The person may need new relationships and material arrangements in which a wider range of conduct becomes possible. Otherwise, the old persona remains necessary for survival, even after its cost is understood. The shadow also contains a problem of proportion. Not every dislike conceals a disowned similarity. Some people accurately perceive danger, manipulation, or incompetence. If projection is assumed whenever emotion is strong, legitimate judgment is weakened. A more careful inquiry separates observation from surplus. What did the other person actually do? What conclusion follows from that evidence? Which part of the reaction belongs to an older pattern? The aim is not to reverse the judgment automatically, but to make it more exact. Group projection is harder because it is supported by shared stories. Members repeat the same images of an opponent, reward one another for outrage, and treat doubt as disloyalty. The projected qualities may then be enacted within the group under different names. Aggression becomes righteous defense. Censorship becomes protection. Ambition becomes service. Shadow work at this scale requires institutions that permit internal criticism, historical memory, and contact with people who cannot be contained by the group image. Positive projection deserves equal attention. A teacher, therapist, leader, or artist may appear to possess complete wisdom or courage. The admiration can support development by showing a possibility not yet claimed. It becomes dangerous when the actual person is relieved of ordinary accountability. Charisma then turns contradiction into proof of depth and boundary violations into special insight. Reclaiming the projection means allowing the admired figure to become human without discarding everything learned. The ethical purpose of shadow recognition is therefore not self-fascination. It is a reduction in the amount of unconscious material imposed on other people. A more spacious self leaves more room for the other's reality. This does not produce perfect objectivity. It creates a repeated practice of asking where one's certainty came from and what evidence might alter it. The result is less dramatic than conquering darkness, but more relevant to ordinary responsibility. Part 8. Anima and Animus in their time. In Jung's classical account, a man's unconscious carried an inner feminine figure called the Anima, while a woman's unconscious carried an inner masculine figure called the Animus. These figures influenced feeling, opinion, attraction, creativity, and relationships. They could appear in dreams and fantasies or be projected onto actual people. Encountering them was supposed to deepen the relation between consciousness and the unconscious. The basic intuition concerns psychological otherness. A conscious identity develops by emphasizing some qualities and leaving others less differentiated. What is excluded may return with emotional force, often in a form shaped by desire and cultural expectation. Intimate relationships then become charged by more than two present individuals. Each person also meets images accumulated from parents, stories, ideals, and earlier attachments. Jung's gendered formulation, however, treated masculine and feminine qualities as opposites distributed through a binary model. It often associated women with eros, relatedness, and feeling, while associating men with logos, discrimination, and thought. His descriptions of the animus in women could be markedly less generous than his accounts of the anima in men. Personal and cultural stereotypes were presented with universal reach. Feminist scholars within and outside analytical psychology have criticized this essentialism. The classical model can turn social restrictions into psychic nature. If women are denied authority and then authority is called inherently masculine, the theory explains the result by repeating the arrangement that produced it. The model also fits poorly with the diversity of sexual orientation, gender identity, embodiment, and family structure. Some later Jungians have abandoned the rule that anima belongs only to men and animus only to women. They treat the pair as symbolic modes available to any psyche, or replace them with less gendered accounts of inner otherness, relationship, agency, and receptivity. Others preserve the historical terms while emphasizing that archetypal patterns should not be confused with biological sex or social role. These revisions can be creative, but they should not be retroactively credited to Jung as if the original problem never existed. A more cautious residue can be stated without assigning traits by sex. Every identity has an outside. Qualities excluded from conscious self-description may be encountered through fascination, fear, or idealization. Relationships often carry projections that exceed what another person has actually shown. Development involves recognizing the other person as other, while reclaiming the inner possibilities that had been placed upon them. Suppose someone repeatedly falls in love with people who seem to possess all mystery, spontaneity, and direction. At first, the attraction may feel like discovery of a destined complement. Over time, the pattern may reveal capacities the admirer has not cultivated. This does not make the beloved unreal or the relationship meaningless. It asks whether one person is being burdened with living an unlived portion of another's life. The same reasoning applies beyond romance. A mentor can receive the image of perfect wisdom. A public figure can embody decisive power. An artist can seem to own a freedom that the admirer has prohibited internally. Withdrawing the projection does not destroy admiration. It changes admiration from captivity into information. Anima and Animus remain historically important because they show Jung trying to describe the psyche's encounter with what conscious identity calls not me. They remain ethically risky because his not me was organized by a rigid account of man and woman. The concept becomes usable today only when its history stays visible and its categories lose their authority to prescribe who a person should be. This chapter also reveals a general rule for reading Jung. A concept can contain an illuminating psychological relation and an obsolete cultural arrangement at the same time. Wholeness does not require preserving every inherited term. Sometimes the work of differentiation must be applied to the theory itself. The revision should remain concrete. Replacing masculine and feminine with abstract energies changes little if the old hierarchy stays intact. A contemporary approach asks how a person's excluded qualities were shaped by family, embodiment, social reward, danger, race, class, sexuality, and chosen identity. Inner otherness then becomes plural. No single symbolic pair can represent every difference through which a person comes to know what the conscious role left outside. Part 9. The Compass of Psychological Types. Jung's Psychological Types, published in 1921, offered another map of difference. Its best-known distinction is between introversion and extroversion. In his system, these were attitudes, directions of psychological interest. Extroversion tended to orient toward the object, the surrounding people and conditions. Introversion tended to orient toward the subject, the inner response and governing idea. These attitudes were not simple measures of sociability. A lively public speaker might still be guided chiefly by an inner standard. A quiet observer might be highly attentive to external facts. Nor did Jung imagine that one attitude existed without the other. He described preferences and imbalances, not two sealed species. A developed person needed some capacity to move in both directions, even if one remained more habitual. He combined the attitudes with 4 functions: thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition. Thinking asks how ideas connect and whether a judgment is logically coherent. Feeling in Jung's technical use, evaluates worth, fit, acceptance, or rejection. It is not the same as being emotionally expressive. Sensation registers what is present through perception. Intuition attends to possibilities, patterns, and what may be emerging beyond immediately given facts. Jung grouped thinking and feeling as judging functions because they evaluate. Sensation and intuition were perceiving functions because they take in experience in different ways. One function may become especially differentiated and reliable, while an opposing function remains less conscious and more awkward. The inferior function is not worthless. It can be a point of vulnerability and also a route toward neglected life. Consider a planner whose thinking is precise and whose sensation notices every practical constraint. In a crisis, this style may be invaluable. Yet choices about loyalty or meaning may be treated as defective calculations. Feeling judgments then appear indirectly through sudden attachment, offended pride, or dependence on another person's approval. Development would not require abandoning thought. It would require learning that value cannot always be derived from efficiency. Or consider a person led by intuition, quick to see possibilities and hidden connections. The gift can become instability if present facts are continually sacrificed to the next opening. The neglected sensation function may return through forgotten appointments, physical exhaustion, or fascination with small concrete rituals. The typological account does not excuse these outcomes. It names an imbalance that conscious practice might address. Jung developed the typology partly to understand disagreements, including the diverging perspectives of Freud and Alfred Adler. A theory may appear self-evident because it expresses the theorist's preferred way of attending. Typology, therefore, had an epistemic purpose. It warned that observers participate in what they see, and that one-sided methods can mistake their own angle for the whole field. The popular afterlife of these ideas often obscures that warning. The Myers-Briggs Type Indicator was inspired by Jung, but it is a later instrument created by Catherine Cook Briggs and Isabel Briggs Myers. Its familiar four-letter codes are not identical to Jung's model. It added categories and measurement practices of its own, and it turned fluid psychological tendencies into a widely marketed classification system. Empirical studies have questioned whether the Myers-Briggs instrument measures truly separate, dichotomous types. Personality traits often appear more continuous. A person can fall near the middle, and results may shift. The Big Five trait model has stronger standing in contemporary personality psychology, though it asks different questions. Extroversion in trait research overlaps only partly with Jung's directional attitude. It is therefore misleading to say that someone is scientifically proven to be a Jungian type, or that a four-letter label predicts vocation, compatibility, or destiny. Types can become another persona, a compact identity that filters evidence. I am this kind of person can quietly become I need not develop what is difficult. Used more lightly, the typology remains a vocabulary for difference. It asks which kinds of information receive trust, which judgments come easily, and which capacities are delegated to partners or colleagues. Its best function is not sorting people into boxes. It is revealing the box from which a person has been looking. The typological compass also prepares us for Jung's method of dream interpretation. A dream may present the neglected attitude or inferior function in unfamiliar form. Yet a compass does not decide the destination, and a symbol does not carry one message for every dreamer. Functions should not be confused with abilities. A person may value thinking and reason poorly, or trust sensation while missing obvious detail. Preference describes where attention tends to go, not how accurately it performs. Skill depends on education, practice, health, context, and feedback. This difference prevents type language from flattering the user. Calling oneself intuitive does not make every hunch insightful, just as calling oneself a thinker does not make every conclusion logical. Part 10. Dreams and the Work of Symbols. Jung shared with Freud the conviction that dreams deserved sustained attention. He rejected the idea that they were meaningless debris, but he resisted a standard path from image to hidden wish. For Jung, the dream was a spontaneous self-portrayal of the psyche's current situation, expressed in symbolic form. Its images could refer backward to personal history and forward to unrealized possibilities. One of his central ideas was compensation. Conscious life tends to become one-sided. A dream may restore a neglected perspective, not by issuing a clear correction, but by producing an image with a different emotional logic. The admired executive dreams of being unable to find a seat. The self-effacing caretaker dreams of occupying an enormous house. These examples do not have automatic meanings. They illustrate how a dream might counterbalance a waking position. Compensation is not always opposition. A dream can support a conscious direction, intensify a warning, or reveal a conflict that waking thought already senses. Jung also considered sequences of dreams more informative than isolated specimens. Repeated motifs may change, and the change may matter more than any single interpretation. A locked door opens. A distant animal comes nearer. A guide who once commanded becomes willing to answer questions. The first task is context. Who are the people in the dream? What personal associations belong to the place? What happened the previous day? What feeling remains? A childhood kitchen in one life may carry safety, in another humiliation, and in another neither. The interpreter who reaches first for an archetype risks replacing the dream with theory. Jung sometimes distinguished an objective level from a subjective one. On the objective level, a dream figure may concern the actual person represented. On the subjective level, the figure may personify an aspect of the dreamer's own psyche. Both levels can be relevant. Dreaming of an impatient friend may reflect a real conflict and an impatience the dreamer has not acknowledged. Amplification becomes useful only after personal associations are heard. Historical parallels can show that an image has possibilities beyond private memory. A circular arrangement may recall mandalas, city plans, clocks, tables, or ritual spaces. But the comparison should enlarge uncertainty in a productive way. If it ends inquiry by declaring the circle to be the self, it has become a code. Modern dream science does not establish Jung's theory of compensation or archetypal meaning. Research examines sleep stages, memory, emotion, threat simulation, continuity with waking concerns, and the neural conditions of dreaming. Findings that dreams often incorporate waking life can coexist with some compensatory interpretations, but they do not validate a general symbolic system. Scientific explanation and personal interpretation answer different questions, though they can constrain one another. Dream interpretation is also vulnerable to suggestion. Once an analyst offers an impressive meaning, a client may adapt memories and feelings to fit it. A responsible practice keeps interpretations tentative and watches whether they increase specificity, agency, and contact with reality. The dreamer is not required to accept the analyst's symbolic expertise. There are situations in which intense dream or visionary work may be destabilizing. Jung's own experiments should not be copied as a universal self-help technique, especially during severe distress or impaired reality testing. Educational discussion cannot determine what is safe for an individual. The presence of vivid imagery does not itself prove spiritual development, hidden genius, or pathology. At their most useful, dreams interrupt the monopoly of the waking narrator. They place familiar concerns in unfamiliar arrangements. A symbol can hold attention near something not yet ready for a plain sentence. This patience with incomplete meaning became the basis of active imagination, the method Jung used when he did not wait for sleep but entered into dialogue with an image while awake. The value of an interpretation is tested after waking. Does it help the dreamer notice a relationship, revise an assumption, or tolerate a feeling with greater precision? Does it fit the series of dreams better than competing readings? An interpretation that produces only admiration for its cleverness has little residue. Jungian practice is most defensible when symbolic insight returns to observable life and remains open to revision there. A dream journal can create the impression that accumulation alone produces understanding. Pages fill with rooms, animals, strangers, and journeys, yet the dreamer may become more dependent on interpretation rather than less. Jung's approach suggests that the useful unit is not simply the isolated image, but the relation between image, waking attitude, emotion, and subsequent life. A symbol earns attention by changing the question the person can ask. It does not earn authority by appearing mysterious. Compensation should also be distinguished from automatic reversal. If a confident person dreams of failure, the dream may challenge conscious inflation. It may also rehearse a realistic fear, repeat an earlier humiliation, or reflect recent stress. The compensatory reading becomes stronger when it fits a sequence and helps explain a one-sided attitude. It remains a hypothesis. Dreams do not arrive with labels identifying their psychological function. The same caution applies to prospective meaning. Jung sometimes believed dreams anticipated future development, not by predicting external events, but by presenting possibilities not yet conscious. This can be understood without prophecy. The mind registers weak signals, unresolved intentions, bodily states, and relational changes that waking attention has not integrated. A dream can organize these into an image that later appears insightful. The effect is remarkable while remaining compatible with ordinary processes of perception and inference. Symbols differ from signs in Jung's usage. A sign points toward a known meaning, like a mark on a map. A living symbol expresses something that cannot yet be stated adequately in one concept. This is why a symbol should not be exhausted too quickly. If the dream sea is declared to mean the unconscious and inquiry stops, the symbol has been converted into a sign. Its depth came partly from the coexistence of fear, attraction, movement, memory, and scale. Yet endless openness can become another avoidance. Interpretation should eventually return to life. Does the dream clarify a conflict, suggest a conversation, reveal a neglected feeling, or change how a decision is held? A person who collects symbolic meanings without altering any relation may be using depth as decoration. Jung's best clinical insight is that consciousness must respond, even if the response is only to wait with greater honesty. Dream work also occurs between people. The analyst's associations, cultural education, and expectations influence which possibilities become visible. This can enrich interpretation, but it creates asymmetry. The analyst may speak with confidence while the dreamer feels pressure to discover the suggested meaning. A responsible relationship treats disagreement as information. The dreamer can say that an interpretation is elegant and still wrong. Scientific research and symbolic interpretation can coexist if their claims remain distinct. Research may explain memory incorporation, emotional processing, or the physiology of sleep. Symbolic work asks how an image functions in a person's narrative and relationship to experience. Neither question automatically answers the other. Jung becomes most defensible when symbolic meaning is offered as a disciplined human interpretation rather than a substitute for empirical mechanism. The dream then becomes neither divine telegram nor neural rubbish. It is an event produced by a sleeping mind, shaped by body, memory, culture, and processes not under deliberate control. Its value lies in the encounter with another arrangement of one's material. Waking consciousness remains responsible for deciding what, if anything, follows. Part 11. The Red Book and Active Imagination. After the break with Freud, Jung entered a period he later called his confrontation with the unconscious. Beginning in 1913, he deliberately allowed waking fantasies to unfold, recorded them in notebooks now known as the Black Books, and later reworked much of the material in an elaborate red leather volume. He wrote in calligraphy, painted images, and arranged dialogues in a form that resembles myth, vision, and philosophical drama. The work is known as Liber Novus, the New Book, or more simply, the Red Book. Jung worked on it for roughly 16 years, though he did not publish it. A scholarly facsimile edition appeared in 2009, decades after his death. Its publication changed the historical understanding of his psychology by revealing how closely many later concepts were connected to this sustained experiment in imagination. The Red Book is not a conventional clinical report, a diary in the ordinary sense, or a secret manual containing the final key to Jung. Its figures speak with different voices. Its narrator undergoes descents, confrontations, reversals, and encounters with a soul. Jung added reflections that attempt to draw psychological and theological meaning from the fantasies. The form deliberately refuses the smooth authority of a treatise. Active imagination was the name he later gave to the broader method. A person begins with an image, mood, bodily impression, or dream fragment, then allows it to develop without directing it toward a predetermined result. If a figure appears, the person may ask what it wants and attend to the response. The encounter can be written, painted, modeled, moved, or spoken. Consciousness participates, but it does not write every line in advance. This differs from passive reverie. Jung wanted the conscious ego to answer what emerged, question it, and make an ethical judgment. The image was not automatically wise because it came unbidden, nor was the goal to dissolve into fantasy. The work lay in maintaining a relation between imagination and ordinary life, then considering what responsibility followed. Imagine an artist who cannot begin a project and repeatedly sees, at the edge of thought, a small room with no windows. In active imagination, the artist might enter the room in writing and notice a covered table. The cloth might be removed, or it might refuse to move. The sequence is not valuable because the room has a universal meaning. It is valuable if the exchange reveals a conflict that deliberate planning could not approach. Several interpretations of Jung's own experience have been offered. Admirers describe disciplined exploration and creative self-healing. Critics see grandiosity, spiritual speculation, or unstable boundaries between private revelation and psychological theory. Some retrospective writers have attempted psychiatric diagnosis. Such diagnosis is hazardous. Historical documents cannot substitute for a clinical examination, and visionary experience alone does not determine a disorder. The record also shows that Jung continued professional and family activities during much of this period. His functioning complicates the dramatic story of a complete breakdown. At the same time, the material was clearly intense, and he himself worried about the danger of being overwhelmed. The safest conclusion is descriptive. He conducted a prolonged, personally consequential self-experiment that became a workshop for his later ideas. From it emerged a stronger emphasis on inner figures, the relation between ego and self, the process of individuation, and the psychological need for myth. The Red Book also exposes the spiritual and theological ambition that Jung's published scientific language could partially conceal. His psychology was not built only from patients observed at a distance. It was built from an effort to treat his own fantasies as events demanding dialogue. That origin creates an internal tension. A private experiment can generate hypotheses, metaphors, and therapeutic techniques. It cannot by itself establish a universal structure of the psyche. Jung often moved from phenomenological fact, the fact that an image was experienced, toward claims about what the image revealed beyond one person. The first claim is secure as testimony. The second requires independent support. Active imagination has influenced analytical therapy, expressive arts, and many creative practices. It can help some people give form to conflicting emotion. It can also encourage inflation if every image is treated as revelation, or blur reality when grounding is weak. Jungian clinicians have therefore developed boundaries around its use. The method belongs in a relationship of judgment, not in a romance with the extraordinary. The Red Book's most enduring image is not any single painted figure. It is the image of consciousness sitting across from what it did not author and still choosing to reply. From that conversation, Jung developed the idea that the ego is a center, but not the center of the whole psyche. Part 12. The Self and the Work of Individuation. In ordinary speech, self often means the conscious person, my opinions, memories, body, plans, and name. Jung used the capitalized self for something larger. The ego was the center of consciousness. The self was the proposed center and totality of the psyche, conscious and unconscious together. Because that totality cannot become fully conscious, the self appears indirectly through symbols and organizing experiences. Circles, balanced forms, quaternities, divine figures, stones, children, and mandalas could symbolize the self in Jung's readings. No single image was identical with it. The self was a regulating idea for psychic wholeness, and at times Jung described it in language close to an inner image of God. This ambiguity between psychological concept and metaphysical implication runs through his later work. Individuation was the process of becoming a more differentiated whole in relation to the self. It did not mean individualism, isolation, or designing a unique lifestyle. Nor did it mean expressing every impulse. Jung described it as a movement away from unconscious identification with collective roles and toward a personality capable of living its particular obligations. The process often begins when an established adaptation no longer works. A role that organized the first half of life becomes too small. Success loses its power to direct. A relationship exposes a repeated projection. A dream contradicts a settled self-image. What first appears as failure may reveal that the personality has been built around only part of its available life. Individuation includes encounters with persona, shadow, and other unconscious figures, but it is not a staircase climbed in a fixed order. Jung's own presentations vary, and later diagrams can make the process look more standardized than it is. Real development circles backward, repeats conflicts under new conditions, and remains shaped by health, class, family, politics, and chance. The ego's task is neither surrender nor conquest. If it denies unconscious contents, it remains narrow and easily possessed by them. If it identifies with an archetypal image, it may become inflated, convinced of special wisdom or destiny. Jung emphasized differentiation. An image can be taken seriously without being taken literally, and a powerful feeling can be acknowledged without becoming the law. This is where opposites enter. A person may value independence and need attachment, seek achievement and require rest, carry love and resentment toward the same person. Consciousness often tries to solve such conflicts by choosing one side and discrediting the other. Jung thought development sometimes required holding the tension until a new symbolic form or practical arrangement emerged. He called the function that produces such a new relation the transcendent function. The word transcendent did not necessarily mean supernatural. It referred to a transition beyond an established opposition. The result is not always a grand synthesis. It may be a modest third position, a boundary that allows care without self-erasure, a form of work that joins discipline with play, or grief that preserves love without denying loss. The idea can sound self-validating. If every compromise is called a symbol from the self, the theory explains nothing. A genuine third position must survive contact with consequences. Does it increase reality, responsibility, and relationship, or only give a noble name to avoidance? Jung's system needs this ethical and practical test because symbolic intensity can make poor judgment feel meaningful. Individuation also depends on society. Jung sometimes wrote as if the differentiated individual stood against a flattening mass. There is truth in the danger of conformity, yet no self becomes whole alone. Language, care, work, law, education, and recognition are social conditions of development. A psychology focused on inner integration can underestimate injustice that cannot be solved by private insight. Nor is individuation an achievement reserved for a refined elite, though Jung's examples and social setting could imply one. People develop through ordinary acts of differentiation, revising an inherited loyalty, recognizing a pattern in conflict, accepting a limitation, choosing a responsibility that fits. Symbolic work may accompany these acts, but no mythic vocabulary is required for them to be real. The self is therefore best held in two ways at once. Historically, it is Jung's hypothesis of an ordering totality with religious resonance. Practically, it is an image that prevents the current ego from claiming to be the whole person. We need not prove that the self exists as a separate psychic entity to benefit from the reminder that conscious identity is partial. Wholeness, in this account, remains unfinished. Integration changes the relationship to conflict. It does not abolish conflict. The person becomes more capable of hearing incompatible claims, locating their sources, and choosing with fewer illusions of innocence. This work also changes across the lifespan, because the demands of youth are not the demands of age. Individuation is often marketed as the discovery of a hidden authentic identity, but Jung's account resists that simplicity. The process does not reveal a single preference buried beneath social pressure. It changes the relation among conscious roles, unconscious tendencies, inherited obligations, and new possibilities. The result may require giving up a cherished picture of authenticity. A person can discover that the desire to be entirely independent was itself a defensive adaptation, not the voice of a pure inner self. The self, as Jung uses the term, is larger than the ego. It represents the psyche's totality and the regulating pattern through which greater wholeness may emerge. Because totality cannot become fully conscious, the self appears symbolically through images of centers, circles, unions, divine children, rulers, or organizing figures. These images are not proof of a metaphysical entity. They are ways the psyche may represent an order that the ego experiences but does not control. The distinction protects against one form of inflation while inviting another. The ego can learn that it is not the whole psyche. Yet someone who identifies personal preference with the self may claim sacred authority for ordinary desire. A career change, romantic attachment, or conflict with family becomes destiny. Jungian language is especially vulnerable here because symbolic intensity can feel like command. Discernment requires time, consequence, and the perspectives of people not captured by the same image. Individuation also unfolds with independence. No one becomes a self alone. Language, care, education, work, and recognition come through others. Differentiation from collective expectations does not cancel these relations. It makes participation more conscious. A person may continue in a family or profession while no longer using the role as a complete identity. Conversely, leaving a role can be necessary without guaranteeing development. Escape and differentiation are not the same. Middle life receives special emphasis because strategies that secured the first half may become constricting. Achievement, parenthood, status, or expertise can organize decades of useful effort. Later, neglected questions return. What remains when the role is no longer expanding? Which capacities were postponed? What does responsibility mean when ambition changes? Jung interprets this not as a universal timetable, but as a recurring developmental pressure. Social and economic conditions affect who has room to respond. Wholeness includes moral discrimination. Integrating aggression does not make aggression good. Recognizing dependency does not require surrendering judgment to another. The work is to bring motives into a relation where choice becomes more possible. A person may still refuse an impulse after understanding it, but the refusal is less likely to return as projection or compulsion. Integration increases accountability because the ego can no longer claim that the unwanted act came from nowhere. There is no final certificate of individuation. The psyche changes through illness, aging, loss, intimacy, and historical events. A balance achieved in one period becomes inadequate in another. This open quality separates individuation from a heroic completion myth. The mature person is not someone who has harmonized every opposite. It is someone more able to notice one-sidedness, tolerate correction, and remain in relation to what cannot be fully mastered. The self can therefore be held as a symbol of orientation rather than possession. It asks the ego to serve a life larger than its immediate self-description. Whether that larger order is understood psychologically, religiously, or poetically will differ. The practical test is modest. Does the symbol deepen reality, responsibility, and relation, or does it make the person grander and less correctable? Part 13. Morning, Afternoon, and the Stages of Life. Jung viewed development as a movement through qualitatively different tasks. The first part of life generally requires an outward construction, separation from childhood dependence, education, work, partnership, social position, and the practical formation of an ego. A young adult cannot solve every conflict by turning inward. The world asks for skills, commitments, and the ability to meet conditions not chosen. Problems arise when the strategies of morning are carried unchanged into afternoon. The qualities that built a career may not answer questions of mortality or meaning. Competition can continue after its purpose has vanished. A parent whose identity depended on being needed may struggle when children leave. A person may have fulfilled the social plan and discover that the inner life was never consulted. Jung made midlife central because he saw it as a frequent turning point from expansion toward reflection and integration. This did not create the modern idea of a midlife crisis, and his descriptions should not be treated as a biological schedule. Lives unfold unevenly. Economic insecurity, illness, migration, caregiving, discrimination, or war can reorder developmental tasks. Some people confront mortality early, others begin new outward projects late. The durable insight is that adaptation has a history. A defense can be intelligent when formed and restrictive decades later. A persona suited to one setting can become a prison in another. Development may require grieving a version of success that once provided genuine direction. The task is not to condemn the younger self, but to recognize when its map no longer describes the terrain. Jung also warned against premature inwardness. A young person may use spiritual or psychological language to avoid ordinary commitments. The fantasy of exceptional depth can conceal fear of employment, intimacy, or failure. Individuation is not a private exemption from common life. The unconscious does not excuse an unpaid debt, a broken promise, or a skill never practiced. In later life, Jung saw a greater need to make a psychological relation to death. He did not offer empirical proof of survival after death. He suggested that the psyche benefits from treating death as a destination toward which life can form an attitude. Religious images may help some people, while others may find meaning in memory, continuity of care, or the limits that make choice significant. His language about stages sometimes reflects the European professional class he knew best. Marriage, career, and a stable social role cannot be assumed as universal milestones. A contemporary reading must distinguish the broader developmental question from the narrow social template. What has a life asked a person to build, and what now needs revision? The answer will vary with culture and circumstance. The stage model also complicates the ideal of balance. Early development may require useful one-sidedness. A musician practices at the expense of other possibilities. A new parent temporarily reorganizes attention around care. Integration does not mean keeping every capacity equally developed at every moment. It means that necessary specialization can later be reconsidered instead of becoming permanent unconscious fate. An ordinary example is the dependable organizer who has held a family together for years. The role contains skill, love, and perhaps unspoken control. When circumstances change, exhaustion appears. A Jungian reading would ask what qualities were excluded to sustain dependability. Play, receptivity, uncertainty, and the ability to receive care may now arrive as irritations or longings. No symbol decides what to do, but the conflict becomes more legible. The same approach can illuminate retirement, bereavement, or a change in health without turning hardship into a hidden gift. Loss is not valuable merely because it forces reflection. Jung's developmental frame is strongest when it helps a person meet change, and weakest when it romanticizes suffering as a message from the self. Morning and afternoon are metaphors, not laws. Their calm usefulness lies in permitting a life to change its governing question. The early question may be, what can I establish? The later question may become, what have I neglected, and what kind of relation can I make to what cannot be completed? Therapy was one place where Jung tried to hold that changing question between two people. Part 14. The Analytic Relationship. Jungian analysis shares a family resemblance with other depth psychologies. It uses conversation, attention to recurring patterns, dreams, fantasies, emotion, and the relationship between analyst and client. Its distinctive emphasis lies in symbolic material, individuation, and the possibility that symptoms may carry an undeveloped meaning as well as a history of injury or conflict. This does not mean that every symptom is a wise message. Pain can narrow a life, and effective treatment may require medical care, social support, behavioral change, medication, or another evidence-based therapy. A symbolic interpretation that ignores risk or impairment is not deeper because it sounds meaningful. Jungian work belongs within the larger responsibilities of mental health care. Jung resisted a purely mechanical technique. He thought the analyst's personality participated in treatment and that each case could require a different approach. At times he compared the encounter to two chemical substances altering one another. The analyst was not an untouched expert who interpreted from outside. This recognition anticipated later attention across therapies to the working alliance and the clinician's responses. Transference names the movement of earlier relational expectations into the analytic relationship. A client may experience the analyst as a rescuing parent, a disappointed authority, an inaccessible lover, or a rival. Countertransference refers broadly to the analyst's emotional responses, including reactions shaped by the analyst's own history. These responses can provide information, but only if they are examined rather than acted out. Jung treated transference as both personal and sometimes archetypal. Personal history remains indispensable. An actual childhood relationship cannot be replaced by a mythic label. The archetypal level tries to describe the unusual magnitude that the relationship can acquire. The analyst may appear to embody wisdom, judgment, healing, or betrayal. Such intensity increases the need for boundaries, not the right to relax them. The power imbalance is real. A client brings vulnerability and may grant the analyst unusual authority over meaning. Jung's own complicated relationships with patients and collaborators are part of the field's ethical history. Modern professional standards concerning consent, dual relationships, confidentiality, supervision, and sexual boundaries developed because insight alone does not protect against misuse. Projection is gradually withdrawn when the other person becomes more ordinary and more distinct. The analyst is neither savior nor demon. The client can reclaim capacities that had been located in the analyst while recognizing genuine help that was received. Ideally, dependence is not shamed. It is understood and transformed. What evidence supports Jungian psychotherapy? A review of empirical studies found encouraging outcomes in naturalistic and retrospective research, with some improvements lasting after treatment. Yet the evidence base has important limits. Many studies are not randomized, controlled trials, samples can be small, treatment is long and difficult to standardize, and authors within the tradition may be evaluating their own approach. The findings justify continued study, not sweeping claims of superiority. Broader research on psychodynamic therapies cannot simply be credited to specifically Jungian concepts. If a therapy helps through attention, alliance, emotional processing, and sustained reflection, that does not establish the collective unconscious or archetypal interpretation. Treatment outcome and theoretical truth are related but separate questions. An incorrect explanation can accompany a helpful relationship, while a plausible theory can be poorly practiced. The therapeutic legacy is therefore mixed and living. Jung helped preserve attention to meaning, imagination, religion, creativity, later life, and the analyst's participation. His followers developed sandplay, expressive methods, and diverse approaches to dreams and culture. At the same time, the field remains relatively peripheral to mainstream clinical research and must continue to clarify its methods, risks, and evidence. The strongest version of Jungian practice is humble about interpretation. It offers an image, watches what follows, and remains willing to be wrong. It distinguishes symbolic depth from mystical certainty. It returns insight to ordinary relationships, work, and care. Such practice leads naturally toward Jung's psychology of religion, where the border between psychic fact and metaphysical claim becomes especially delicate. Analysis is sometimes imagined as an expert decoding a patient from a position of superior knowledge. Jung's account became more reciprocal. The analyst brings training and experience, but also a personality, history, blind spots, and emotional reactions. Treatment occurs between two psychic systems. Each affects the other. This insight anticipates later attention to countertransference and the analyst's participation in the therapeutic field, though different schools formulate the process in different terms. Reciprocity does not erase professional asymmetry. The patient discloses under conditions of vulnerability, while the analyst controls time, fees, boundaries, and much of the interpretive frame. Claiming that both people are equally transformed can conceal these differences. Ethical practice requires the analyst to remain responsible for the structure, even while acknowledging mutual influence. Personal reactions should be examined through supervision and reflection, rather than turned into burdens the patient must manage. Jung compared deep analysis to a chemical process in which both substances change through contact. The metaphor emphasizes that interpretation alone is insufficient. A correct explanation delivered without trust may have little effect. A mistaken interpretation can become powerful if the relationship rewards agreement. The emotional field determines which meanings can be heard, resisted, tested, or revised. This is why technique cannot be separated from character and ethics. Transference places earlier expectations into the present relationship. The analyst may be experienced as rescuing parent, remote judge, ideal lover, dangerous authority, or source of secret wisdom. These perceptions can reveal patterns, but they also respond to the analyst's actual behavior. Not every discomfort is a projection from childhood. A late analyst is late. A dismissive interpretation is dismissive. Therapeutic authority becomes abusive when present conduct is protected by explaining every objection as resistance. The analyst also receives projections that can be gratifying. Being treated as wise, uniquely understanding, or spiritually advanced may support a professional persona. Jung's language of archetypal figures can intensify this danger if the analyst identifies with healer, guide, or wise old person. The work of withdrawing projection applies to both participants. A trustworthy analyst helps symbolic authority return to the patient's own capacity for reflection and choice. Goals in Jungian analysis are broader than symptom removal, but breadth should not make outcomes unaccountable. Relief from suffering, improved relationships, greater flexibility, and ability to work are not shallow aims. They provide concrete evidence against which interpretations can be judged. A symbolic narrative that becomes elaborate while daily functioning deteriorates requires scrutiny. Depth is not measured by obscurity. Cultural difference further complicates the relationship. An analyst may interpret family duty as insufficient individuation, religious practice as projection, or collective identity as a persona because the analyst's own culture prizes autonomy. The patient's meanings must not be forced into one developmental map. Comparative symbols can be helpful only when historical and lived context remain authoritative. At its best, the analytic relationship creates a protected interval between reaction and action. An image can be considered without obedience, a motive admitted without humiliation, and a conflict held without immediate solution. The analyst does not supply a finished self. The relationship supports the patient's growing ability to remain in dialogue with inner and outer realities. Its success appears when less interpretive domination is needed, not when the analyst's language has colonized the person's life. Part 15. Myth, Religion, and Answer to Job. Jung took religious experience seriously at a time when several influential theories treated religion chiefly as error, illusion, or social residue. He did not thereby become a conventional theologian. His stated professional concern was the psychological reality of religious images. The fact that ideas of gods, spirits, judgment, sacrifice, rebirth, and salvation have moved human beings, organized communities, and appeared in dreams. He often used the phrase psychic fact. If a person experiences a commanding image, the experience is a fact of mental life, even when its object cannot be established outside the mind. This distinction allows psychology to study the effects of belief without deciding whether a deity exists. It is a useful boundary, though Jung sometimes approached and crossed it in speculative ways. Religion interested him because it supplied forms for encounters with powers greater than the ego. Ritual, doctrine, story, and community could contain such experience, connect it with history, and protect the person from identifying with it. When inherited symbols lost vitality, he thought people remained psychologically religious in their needs while lacking a language for them. Political movements, celebrity, nation, or personal success might then receive sacred intensity. This is an interpretation of modernity, not a settled scientific law. Secular people can live rich, symbolic, and ethical lives, while religious participation can coexist with psychological rigidity. Traditions are also internally diverse. Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Hindu traditions, Buddhism, and other religions cannot be reduced to stages in a Jungian account of psychic development. Jung's comparative method moved rapidly across this diversity. He studied Christian mysticism, Gnosticism, Buddhism, Hindu texts, Taoist thought, and ritual imagery from many societies. He helped draw Western readers toward materials they might not otherwise have encountered. But he often interpreted them through the needs of European modernity, sometimes treating living practices as mirrors for his theory. Mediation can become appropriation when context and authority are lost. Myth performed a related function. For Jung, myth was not merely a false story about the natural world. It was a symbolic narrative through which recurring human conflicts became visible. The hero's departure, ordeal, and return could portray a transformation of identity. A descent could give form to loss of conscious control. A divine child could represent fragile possibility. Yet these motifs do not form one universal plot with one psychological meaning. Stories belong to languages, places, ceremonies, power structures, and communities of interpretation. The same episode may support a ruler, resist a ruler, teach kinship, mark a season, entertain an audience, or preserve a specific history. A purely archetypal reading can miss all of this. The humane use of comparison begins after historical difference has been respected, not before. Jung's answer to Job offers a striking example of both the power and risk of psychological reading. Published in 1952 and included in the volume Psychology and Religion. West and East. The book confronts the biblical story in which Job suffers despite his integrity. Jung reads the divine figure psychologically, attending to contradiction, injustice, consciousness, and moral development within the image of God. He does not write as a neutral biblical scholar. The work is a personal and polemical engagement with Christian symbolism after the catastrophes of the 20th century. Jung argues, in effect, that Job's moral consciousness exposes a deficiency in the deity represented by the story. The later incarnation of God in human form becomes part of a divine movement toward greater consciousness. This is an interpretive drama, not a consensus of theology or historical criticism. The audacity of the book lies in refusing to protect an image of goodness by ignoring suffering. A religious symbol, for Jung, remains alive only if it can contain the shadow. Perfect light casts denied darkness elsewhere. His reading of Christianity repeatedly returns to the problem that Christ as a symbol of total goodness may leave evil psychologically unintegrated. That argument can illuminate the moral cost of idealization. Institutions and individuals become dangerous when they identify completely with goodness and locate all destructiveness outside. But the argument can also turn a distinct religious tradition into raw material for Jung's model of the self. Jewish readings of Job, Christian theologies, literary scholarship, and the experiences of believers cannot be contained by his psychological interpretation. Jung's language about God remains intentionally unstable. At times, God means an image within the psyche. At other times, the psyche seems to open toward a reality not created by the individual. He often declined to make a metaphysical proof while writing in a way that invited metaphysical conclusions. Readers have therefore found him devotional, heretical, agnostic, and prophetic, sometimes on the same page. The distinction worth preserving is between meaning and evidence. A religious image may organize grief, conscience, or hope. Its psychological efficacy does not prove its supernatural truth. Conversely, a scientific account of how belief functions does not settle the theological question. Confusion begins when one kind of claim borrows the authority of the other. For a nighttime listener, there is a quieter residue. Human beings inherit images whose meanings they do not fully control. Some receive them through worship, some through art, family, politics, or dreams. The task is neither to submit automatically nor to dismiss automatically. It is to ask what kind of life an image asks us to build, what suffering it can acknowledge, and what it requires us to deny. This standard applies with special force to the old images of transformation that occupied Jung for decades. In the sealed vessel, the dark material, the divided substance, and the hoped-for conjunction, he believed he had found an earlier symbolic record of individuation. That record came from alchemy. Part 16. The Alchemical Vessel. Alchemy is often remembered as a failed attempt to turn base metals into gold. Historically, it was far more varied. Across long periods and different regions, alchemical practice combined work with substances, theories of matter, medicine, craft knowledge, cosmology, secrecy, religion, and moral aspiration. Modern chemistry emerged from a complicated history that cannot be reduced either to foolish error or to hidden psychotherapy. Jung began sustained study of European alchemical texts in the 1930s. He became fascinated by their obscure images: king and queen, sun and moon, dragon, hermaphrodite, vessel, blackening, whitening, conjunction, death, and renewal. He argued that alchemists projected unconscious psychic processes into matter. Because the chemical work was poorly understood, the laboratory became a screen on which inner transformation appeared in symbolic form. Projection again does the connecting work. An alchemist watches substances darken, separate, combine, evaporate, and crystallize. The material process is real. At the same time, hope, fear, religious expectation, and fantasy shape what the process means. Jung read the texts as if their authors had unknowingly recorded both an operation upon matter and an operation within the psyche. In psychology and alchemy, he placed series of modern dreams beside alchemical motifs. Mandalas and quaternities suggested movements towards psychic order. The obscure prima materia, the original material of the work, resembled the undifferentiated problem from which development begins. The sealed vessel resembled a protected analytic space in which opposed contents could be held long enough to change. The sequence of blackening, whitening, and reddening offered a dramatic grammar. Blackening could symbolize disorientation or encounter with what consciousness rejects. Whitening could suggest differentiation and clarification. Reddening could indicate a return of vitality and a more embodied integration. Later popular summaries often turn these into fixed stages. The historical sources are not so uniform, and Jung's own use is more associative than procedural. The conjunction, or conjunctio, became an image for the union of opposites. It did not mean that all differences disappear. In Jung's preferred reading, Transformation preserves distinction within a larger relation. King and queen, spirit and matter, conscious and unconscious meet, separate and meet again. The image gave him a symbolic language for the transcendent function and for changes in the analytic relationship. There is real interpretive beauty in this work. The vessel suggests why conflict sometimes needs containment instead of immediate solution. A difficult emotion acted out too quickly changes nothing. Held in reflection, conversation, art, or ritual, it may separate into grief, anger, longing, and fear. What seemed like one dark mass becomes differentiated and therefore more available to choice. Yet Jung's historical thesis has been challenged. Alchemists did not all share one secret psychological project, and their texts had technical, religious, economic, and social purposes of their own. To say that their chemistry merely covered individuation can repeat the same reduction Jung opposed in Freud. A rich historical tradition becomes the disguised version of a modern theory. His account also drew heavily on European and Christian alchemy while making broader comparisons that require specialized linguistic and historical knowledge. Symbols change meaning across manuscripts and communities. A dragon in one text cannot be assumed to perform the same psychic role as a serpent in another culture. Similarity is the beginning of inquiry, not its conclusion. Alchemy therefore belongs in the documentary under three separate labels. Historically, it is a diverse set of practices that helped shape knowledge of matter. In Jung's psychology, it is an archive he interpreted as an antecedent of individuation. In therapy and popular culture, it has become a metaphor for transformation. Confusing these levels produces both bad history and inflated psychology. The metaphor can survive the correction. Some changes cannot be forced by a direct command. A contradiction may need a vessel, enough time, safety, and attention for its components to become visible. But there is no guarantee of gold. Containment can become rumination, secrecy, or delay. The value of the vessel is shown by what becomes more truthful and more livable outside it. The alchemical image also corrects a modern appetite for instant transformation. In the old texts, the work is repetitive, uncertain, and vulnerable to failure. Applied as metaphor, that slowness is more credible than a sudden revelation that solves personality. Habits alter through repeated choices, relationships repair through conduct, and insight must become practice. A symbol can orient this labor, but it cannot perform the labor in place of the person or community involved. Jung's alchemical studies also shifted his language toward correspondences between mind and world. He grew interested in events whose timing seemed connected by meaning without an ordinary causal link. The alchemical notion of one world and his long exchange with the physicist Wolfgang Pauli helped frame the most controversial of his mature ideas, synchronicity. Part 17. Synchronicity, History, and the Test of Criticism. Synchronicity is usually defined as meaningful coincidence. The definition sounds simple, but Jung intended more than noticing that two events occur together. He proposed a causal connecting principle. An inner state and an outer event might correspond through meaning, even when neither causes the other in the ordinary sense. His famous examples included dreams or images echoed by unexpected events. The emotional force comes from exact timing. A person is preoccupied with a rare symbol and then encounters it outside. The coincidence feels addressed, as if the boundary between inner and outer life has briefly become transparent. Jung developed the idea over decades and discussed it with Wolfgang Pauli, a major theoretical physicist who also underwent analysis. Their dialogue is historically fascinating. It does not mean that quantum mechanics validates synchronicity. Pauli's participation gave Jung an intellectually serious partner, not experimental confirmation of a causal order of meaning. The statistical and methodological problems are severe. A singular event selected because it feels meaningful does not provide a clear sample. The observer helps define both the coincidence and its significance. Countless non-matching thoughts and events go unrecorded. Memory favors the striking pair. Flexible definitions make it hard to state what result would disconfirm the principle. Probability also produces surprising clusters, especially across a life crowded with dreams, words, people, and events. Human attention is built to detect pattern. This ability is indispensable and can also overreach. Apophenia, confirmation bias, selective recall, and the law of large numbers can explain many experiences of extraordinary coincidence without a causal connection. None of this makes the experience emotionally empty. A coincidence can become meaningful because of what a person does with it, even if chance is sufficient to explain its occurrence. Hearing a childhood song on the day of a funeral may gather memory and grief into one moment. The psychological meaning is real without becoming evidence that the world arranged the broadcast. This modest interpretation differs from Jung's stronger claim. It treats synchronicity as meaning made in response to coincidence, not a principle joining psyche and matter. The stronger claim remains scientifically unestablished. It should not be used to support astrology, paranormal certainty, or predictions, all subjects Jung sometimes explored with a speculative openness that exceeded reliable evidence. His writings on unidentified flying objects likewise approached reports as modern myths and projections while remaining interested in whether an unknown physical residue might exist. The psychologically sound question is what the images expressed in their historical moment. The unsound shortcut is to cite Jung as scientific authority for extraterrestrial visitation or occult causation. This boundary between description and speculation is one of several tests his legacy must face. Another is political and moral history. During the 1930s, Jung took roles in professional organizations operating under the shadow of National Socialism and published statements contrasting Jewish and Germanic psychology. Scholars disagree over aspects of his motives and later conduct, including actions interpreted as assistance to Allied intelligence. There is no responsible way to erase the anti-Semitic language or the opportunism and misjudgment of the period. Some defenders isolate unfortunate phrases from an otherwise universal psychology. Critics argue that the problem reaches deeper into theories of national character, collective destiny, and heroic leadership. Both the documentary record and the conceptual issue deserve attention. A psychology that assigns unconscious characteristics to peoples can turn cultural description into essence, especially under racist political conditions. Jung later criticized Nazism and described the destructive possession of mass movements. That criticism does not cancel his earlier words and institutional choices. Intellectual wholeness is not achieved by balancing one fact against another until responsibility disappears. It is achieved by keeping the contradiction visible and refusing a purified portrait. The same principle applies to colonial language and Eurocentrism. Jung traveled, observed, and corresponded widely, but his accounts sometimes treated non-European people as closer to a supposedly primitive mentality. Such frameworks were common in the anthropology and psychology of his era, and they were still harmful. They supported a developmental hierarchy with modern Europe positioned as conscious observer and other cultures as access points to archaic mind. Later, analytical psychologists have challenged these assumptions, expanded cultural approaches, and revised gender theory. Revision shows that a tradition can learn. It also reveals that the original system was not a timeless map. Jung's categories were made in history, even when they claimed to describe what lies beneath history. Scientific criticism reaches the architecture itself. Complexes began near experimental observation, but the collective unconscious archetypes, compensatory dream theory, individuation, and synchronicity are difficult to operationalize as Jung presented them. The system often relies on interpretive fit. Evidence for a concept can be generated by the same framework that decides what counts as evidence. Falsifiability is not the only measure of value. Historical interpretation, literary criticism, and clinical understanding also use coherence, depth, comparison, and practical consequence. But a concept should not move between interpretive and scientific authority without notice. Archetype may be a productive lens in a novel while remaining an unproven biological hypothesis. Synchronicity may name an experience while failing as a law of nature. The evidence for specifically Jungian therapy is limited but not absent. Naturalistic studies report benefits, yet stronger and more independent research is needed. The cultural influence is easier to establish. Jung shaped psychotherapy, religious studies, art, literary criticism, film analysis, and popular spirituality. His ideas reached Joseph Campbell and many later writers, though popular versions often simplify the original tensions. The language of shadow now circulates through leadership programs and social media. Archetypes organize screenwriting manuals and brand strategy. Introvert has become an everyday identity. Synchronicity names any pleasing coincidence. This diffusion is a form of success, but also a loss of precision. A concept designed to unsettle identity can become merchandise for securing one. Jungian types are frequently merged with the Myers-Briggs system, despite their differences and the psychometric criticism of strict type categories. Shadow work can become a promise of rapid self-mastery. Individuation can be confused with personal exceptionalism. The collective unconscious can be invoked to bypass the hard study of cultural transmission. Each adaptation removes friction, which was often where Jung's thought was most valuable. His therapeutic legacy survives best in questions, not dogmas. What has the conscious position excluded? What projection enlarges this conflict? What meaning does a symptom or image have in this particular life? Which inherited role once protected development and now restricts it? What can be acknowledged without being obeyed? The answers require other disciplines. Neuroscience can investigate mechanisms. Social psychology can test bias and group behavior. History can locate symbols in institutions and power. Anthropology can protect cultural specificity. Feminist and queer scholarship can expose assumptions presented as nature. Clinical research can compare outcomes and harms. Jung's system becomes more credible when it accepts these neighbors rather than claiming to contain them. Contemporary influence is often indirect. Therapists who never identify as Jungian may still invite metaphor, attend to a dream, or ask how a disowned emotion shapes a relationship. Writers and artists use the shadow or trickster without accepting a collective unconscious. This diffusion makes ownership difficult to trace, and many practices have sources beyond Jung. His legacy is therefore less a single school advancing intact than a set of questions absorbed, revised, and sometimes detached from the theory that first made them famous. After all these criticisms, a considerable residue remains. The ego is partial. Emotional patterns can act with relative independence. Roles both enable and restrict. People project unlived possibilities onto others. Symbols can hold meanings that a literal summary loses. Development involves differentiation as well as belonging. None of these claims requires belief in paranormal forces or a universal dictionary of myth. The final question is therefore not whether Jung was simply right or wrong. A system this broad can be illuminating in one register and weak in another. The better question is how to use an interpretive psychology without letting interpretation become immunity from evidence. That question returns us to the divided house, now with more rooms visible and fewer promises that one key will open them all. Synchronicity attracts attention because coincidence can carry an emotional force that causal explanation does not exhaust. A chance meeting occurs during a period of decision. A dream image appears in an unexpected conversation the next day. A rare word repeats across unrelated contexts. Even when probability can account for occurrence, the event may reorganize a person's sense of time and meaning. Jung wanted language for this experience without reducing it to ordinary causation. The difficulty begins when meaningfulness is treated as evidence of an objective connecting principle. Human attention is selective. We remember striking matches and forget thousands of non-matches. We search more actively for patterns during emotional uncertainty. Culture supplies images that make some coincidences legible and leaves others unnoticed. Large populations and long lives create many opportunities for improbable events. Any theory of synchronicity must address these mechanisms before invoking a new principle of nature. Statistical improbability is also easy to overstate after an event. Once a coincidence has occurred, we define it in the exact terms that make it rare. Beforehand, many different events might have felt meaningful. The relevant probability is not simply the chance of this precise image appearing, but the chance that some emotionally resonant match would appear among numerous possibilities. This does not erase the experience. It limits the inference made from it. A psychological use can remain valuable. Instead of asking whether the universe sent a message, one can ask why this event became meaningful now. Which conflict, hope, or fear did it gather? What action does the interpretation encourage? Does it increase attention to reality or exempt the person from evidence? The coincidence becomes material for self-understanding without being promoted into external command. Jung's historical and political record requires the same discipline. Admirers sometimes protect the theory by turning criticism into evidence that the critic fears the unconscious. Critics can flatten the record by treating every concept as reducible to its author's failures. A responsible assessment holds documents, contexts, revisions, institutional choices, and consequences together. Jung's statements concerning Jews, Germans, national psychology, and the politics of the 1930s cannot be dismissed as mere misunderstanding, nor do they settle every independent question raised by analytical psychology. Scientific criticism should specify the level of claim. Concepts such as projection or complex can guide clinical observation without functioning as sharply testable laws. Archetypes may operate fruitfully in literary interpretation while remaining weak as inherited biological structures. Synchronicity may describe a category of meaningful experience while failing as a demonstrated causal principle. Precision allows partial use without wholesale belief. The test of criticism is whether a tradition can learn without protecting its founder's authority. A living Jungian field must revise gender theory, confront cultural appropriation, examine political history, compare outcomes, and accept that some concepts may survive only as metaphors. Fidelity does not require preservation of every claim. It can mean continuing the work of differentiation on the tradition itself. For the individual reader, criticism performs a psychological function similar to the shadow. It returns what admiration excluded. The goal is not disillusionment for its own sake. It is a relation to the work that can withstand complexity. Jung becomes more useful when he is no longer required to be either prophetic sage or discredited mystic. He becomes a historically situated thinker whose observations, errors, imaginative reach, and evidential limits can all remain visible. Part 18. A more spacious wholeness. We began with a person whose respectable life contains a conflict that will not disappear. Jung's answer was not to erase the conflict or crown one voice as the permanent ruler. He asked consciousness to develop a relation to what interrupts it: the charged association, the dream, the projection, the unwanted trait, the symbol whose meaning remains incomplete. This answer is persuasive when it encourages attention, differentiation, and responsibility. A persona is necessary, yet it is not the whole person. A shadow contains what identity has refused, yet recognition does not authorize action. A projection may reveal an unlived capacity, yet the other person remains real and separate. A dream can reopen a question, yet no dictionary decides its message. Jung is less persuasive when interpretive possibility becomes universal explanation. Recurring images do not prove the inheritance of complex symbolic narratives. Therapeutic benefit does not prove every theory used in therapy. A meaningful coincidence does not establish a causal structure of nature. The presence of a physicist in a conversation does not turn speculation into physics. His work also carries burdens that cannot be treated as minor period details. Gender binaries became psychological laws. Cultural difference was sometimes arranged within a European hierarchy. Anti-Semitic statements and institutional compromises in the 1930s remain part of the record. A psychology of shadow must submit to its own demand and resist the wish for an innocent founder. And still, the central human question survives the criticism. How can a person become more whole without becoming uniform? Perhaps by replacing the fantasy of perfect consistency with a practice of better conversation. The practice is inward and outward. It asks what a feeling belongs to, what history a role carries, what evidence and interpretation lacks, and what another person is saying beyond our image of them. Wholeness then becomes spaciousness with limits. It is spacious enough for ambivalence, grief, desire, anger, devotion, uncertainty, and change. It has limits because not every impulse deserves enactment, not every symbol deserves belief, and not every story belongs to the interpreter who finds it useful. Ethics supplies the boundary that fascination alone cannot provide. This view does not promise a final state called individuation. A life may become more integrated and remain unfinished. Old complexes can return under new pressure. A projection withdrawn from one relationship may appear in another. The work is less like completing a puzzle than learning the layout of a house while continuing to live in it. Some rooms are public and carefully arranged. Some hold inherited furniture that no longer fits. One room may contain a window opened by a dream. Another remains locked for good reason or for a reason not yet understood. The task is not to tear down every wall. It is to know more honestly where the walls stand, which doors can be opened, and who else shares the dwelling. Jung gave this task an immense symbolic language. We do not need to accept the whole language to hear what prompted it. Consciousness is an achievement, but it is not solitary. Beneath each settled description moves a larger history of body, attachment, culture, memory, and imagination. To acknowledge that history is not to surrender judgment, it is to give judgment a wider field. Late in the evening, a house does not become whole because every room is brightly lit. Some lamps remain on, others are lowered, and the dark spaces keep their depth without governing the home. What matters is that the person moving quietly through it no longer mistakes one familiar room for the entire house.